Thanks, Sol. Hi, everybody. A few months ago, I was reading a story in Art News about the next generation of buyers, and it started off, one of the sections, with this question: who is the new collector? And immediately underneath it were these lines. Quote, where does he live? What does he do? These were some of the questions asked in an effort to discover if the new collector could fit into a montage composite character. Dealers agree that he is, in general, under 45, end quote. The story then, of course, goes on to try to pin down more precisely who this new force in the art collecting market is. Raise your hand if you've read a story something like this in the past few months. Okay, does anybody think that they read this particular story in Art News? Okay. Tom, I'm going to be really surprised because the story that I'm quoting from was published in 1944. So that means that the collectors under age 45 that they were talking about are now a part of what we know as the greatest generation, which means that the men may have fought in one of the first two world wars. I bring this up because if you are an older member of the art world and you are confused about what's happening among younger collectors, don't worry, young people have been confusing the art market for more than 80 years. So I'm going to try to shed a little more light on that, and then Mazdak will join me to further that effort. But let's start with first principles. Why do we talk about generations at all? The core idea is that culture and world events evolve in such a way that people born in different eras develop meaningfully different preferences, expectations, and default settings about how they approach the world. Now, it's no surprise that aside from social scientists, the groups most obsessed with generational differences are marketers and salespeople. If you want to convince a large number of people to buy something, you'd better know how they think. What you may not know is that the entire concept of youth culture it was originated in the 1940s and was actually basically made up by marketers and salespeople. And the reason for this is that the 1940s, at least in the US, were the first time when you had a substantial number of people between the ages of 14 and 17 who were still going to school. Before then, you basically went directly into the workforce. For comparison's sake, in 1910, in the US, the share of Americans who were still in school between the ages of 14 and 17 was 14%. That's 1 in 4. By 1940, however, that number had risen to 73%, and it went up from there. Now, this matters because high school is an experience that requires people to buy a bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to people younger than them or to people older than them. Stuff like, apparently, outfits like this, which I am glad I was not alive for. But generations themselves are an older idea, and they become important in the context of all this to help push forward this narrative that youth culture is something that changes at regular intervals. Conveniently, this means that businesses have to keep coming up with new stuff to sell new generations of people, and the consulting industry has a really good story for why people need to continue paying them to advise them on what they should be making and how they should be selling it. This little circular economy has eventually led us to this moment where we have this generational breakout. Now, the two generations that we care about for today's purposes are the yellow and the orange. Yellow is millennials, generally understood as people born between 1981 and 1996. I am now an elder millennial, which means this is probably the last time I can credibly speak about anything referring to youth culture. Gen Z is the next up. They were born, generally speaking, between 1997 and 2012. Behind them, you have Gen Alpha, who I'm sure somebody will be on this stage talking about in another 10 years. So, let's talk about millennials before we head on to Gen Z. This is a little bit of an overview of kind of the financial situation for millennials at this point in history. So they are now 1/3 richer than baby boomers were at a similar age. That's from data by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. Their average net worth of millennial households, that's now $360,000. It's about 4 times what it was back in 2016. And overall, millennials have about $2.5 trillion worth of housing wealth. And that was a huge amount. I'm sorry, they've increased their housing wealth by $2.5 trillion since 2020. What about Gen Z? So here's 3 stats to kind of help ground things. They are projected, based on data from Bank of America, to make around $36 trillion in income by 2030. That's 4 times what their earnings were collectively in 2023. They are also projected to spend about $12.6 trillion, and that's 5 times what they spent as a generation last year. And all of this means that they are on pace to be the richest generation ever by 2035 if things keep up the way that they have. This all seems like great news, right? There's a catch. The catch is the cost of living. Now, this is also from Bank of America data, and it just shows how much Gen Z is paying for some basic necessities in comparison to everybody else. So Gen Z is the blue bar on that line, everybody else is the red bar, and you don't have to be super well versed in data analysis or analytics or chart reading to be able to tell that things are not great right now. Basically, Gen Z is paying dramatically more than everyone else for childcare, for rent, and for utilities. So it even gets a little bit worse than that. There's another study that says that 52% of Gen Z survey respondents, quote, aren't making enough money to live the life that they want, and the high cost of living is one of their main financial challenges. So the next time you wonder why people in Gen Z might be a little wary of, say, the cost of a painting, consider the fact that they basically walk around every day of their lives feeling like they're being price gouged by everyone all the time. It's an important thing to probably keep in mind. I'm also contractually obligated to talk about the generational wealth transfer. This is this concept that sometime around 2048, between now and then, something like $124 trillion of wealth will pass down from ultra-high and high net worth individuals to their heirs. You hear about this a lot in the art world. I would just ask you to keep a couple of things in mind the next time that you hear a stat about them, and actually 3 things. First one is this. Almost literally, every bit of data that we have on the Great Wealth Transfer comes from one place. It's this research outfit called Cerulli Associates. They're based in Boston. I don't know how they managed to do this, but they've effectively cornered the market on this data, so much so that they sell access to this report that they do for $21,000 a pop the last time I checked. So that's one thing. We're really getting a lot of our information from this one place. Second thing, when you're talking about wealth transferring, it needs to happen through some kind of a process, right? So this is a report on global family offices, which of course are the kind of private investing institutions that billionaire families have. This was done by UBS, and they found earlier this year that less than half of billionaire families actually have an estate plan in place at this point. So if they die, it becomes chaos as to what happens with their money. Third and finally, as much as we hear about wealth passing down to heirs, the thing is that a majority of the money in the Great Wealth Transfer is not going to pass down, it's going to pass sideways to spouses. So it's not even necessarily going to change generations depending on what the age of the person's spouse was. So again, all of this is just to say that the whole Great Wealth Transfer and all of its promise is a little more complicated than we thought, so much so that when I wrote about it earlier this year, I titled the post this: "The Great Wealth Transfer is a mess, actually." I'm not saying that the money isn't going to move, it is, I just don't think it's going to happen as smoothly as everyone is expecting. So with all that as background, let's talk now about Gen Z and millennials in the art market specifically. Now, you're all familiar with the with the Art Basel and UBS Art Market Report. It's around 250 pages, most recent edition anyway. Does anybody want to guess how many references there are to millennials and Gen Z in this year's edition of the report? Anybody? The answer is 2 references to millennials, 1 reference to Gen Z. One of those references to millennials and the only reference to Gen Z happen in the same sentence. So this is that sentence in question. This is from Alex Glauber, who is one of the kind of supplemental authors. He runs the APAA, which is the Association of Professional Art Advisors. The line is, quote, APAA members reported that millennial clients made 34% of their acquisitions at art fairs, trailed by Gen Z and Gen X at 24% and 22% respectively. Beyond this, most of the data about Gen Z and millennials gets really messy, partly because there's not a lot of effort made to actually separate one from the other, which is sort of weird because this whole concept is supposed to be about the differences between one generation and the next, and yet it seems like basically everyone under the age of 45 just gets thrown into one big bucket. Here are 3 data points that I managed to find, and they all do exactly this thing. So all of these are about people aged 44 and under. First one is that 44% of the buyers and bidders in Christie's Asia sales in 2024 fell into that age group. Second one, 30% of the buyers and bidders globally at Christie's in 2024, also part of that age group. And last but not least, 25 to 33% of buyers and bidders globally at Christie's and Sotheby's were made up of people aged 44 and under, and that's about twice the share of 2019. Now, one reference point that I haven't talked about is this report, which is titled A New Generation of Patrons. It's from Avant Arte, which is co-founded and run by Mazdak Sanii, who is sitting in the audience. He's going to join me shortly. I'm just referencing it so that he knows that I didn't forget that this exists. But we'll get into the actual specifics of some of it in this particular category shortly. Before then, though, I just feel like it's important to take stock of where we are, which is basically that everyone is confused. And that includes me because, again, we have this weird thing happening in the art market where basically everyone agrees that Gen Z and millennial collectors are the future and are becoming more and more important every day, and the future of the industry to some extent depends on them. And yet, the actual amount of information that is out there about how they think and what they want and all those things is incredibly scant. This seems like kind of a problem to me. There is one other kind of bit of light that I think I can shine on this, and it requires us to sort of switch places. That means going from talking about Gen Z and millennial collectors to Gen Z and millennial dealers. So I ended up doing a bunch of reporting on this over the summer for the Financial Times, and it was all sparked by the fact that Blum Gallery, which I'm sure that all of you are aware of, its founder, Tim Blum, announced shortly after Art Basel this year that he was going to, quote-unquote, sunset the gallery. And that this was because of what he described as, quote, burnout at every level, end quote, caused by a system intent on growing, quote, ever outward, upward, and onward after the 2008 financial crisis. This was a big deal because Blum's gallery, formerly Blum and Poe, before Tim Blum's partner Jeff Poe left the business a few years earlier, Blum Gallery was basically the picture of success to dealers in Gen X and ostensibly younger. They had a great headquarters in LA, which you see there. They had a location in Tokyo. They were getting ready to open a big new space in Tribeca this fall. They have a bunch of artists that they've helped drive up to blue chip status. They've done really, I think, path-breaking work in exposing Western audiences to East Asian artists. They do all the best fairs. Basically, everything looked like it was fantastic, and yet it apparently was a disaster behind the scenes for the person who had founded it. Which, of course, raises the question, if this wasn't working, then what is? And what does it mean for the next generation of dealers? tried to answer this question. I just went out and asked a bunch of them what they thought about it. And the consensus, I think, is pretty easily communicated through the headline of the story, which is "The art world's age of empires might be over." What that headline is referring to is not the idea that galleries themselves are going to disintegrate and cease to be a thing, but it refers instead to the idea that the types of galleries that younger dealers are interested in building are actually like diametrically opposed to what I think a lot of us in the art world have been told is the vision of success. One quote that stuck with me through all this was from Bridget Donahue, who is a fantastic gallerist in New York. She just teamed up with Hannah Hoffman in a merger. But what she said is that, quote, "Early on, we established a clear-eyed commitment to 5 shows a year and 1 to 2 art fairs. We made a corrective move to protect myself and my artists from the burnout that Tim Blum describes." So here you have somebody at the very outset of their gallery who was like, I so don't want to be a world-conquering empire that I'm going to set limits for myself right away to kind of hold myself to. And this same basic idea was echoed by the even younger dealers that I talked to. And basically what they're doing is following this same mantra, but in a kind of more polished way, I think, ultimately. The things that really seemed to matter to them were not like having 12 locations in 7 countries around the world or having a roster of over 100 artists. They actually wanted the opposite of that. They're talking about prioritizing things like collaborations, including with other dealers, as well as experimentation, transparency, and the cultivation of really tight-knit communities. And that word community kept coming up over and over and over again. Jacob Hyman, who is a Gen Z dealer, he's one of the co-founders of Amanita Gallery, which I think Elena referenced in her slide of the neighborhood earlier today. He had this to say, which I think is a pretty emblematic quote for the rest of his generation, at least in terms of the people that I spoke to. So, quote, "The recent movements in the art world have, if anything, reinforced our game plan. While the renown and ubiquity of the empire-sized galleries are certainly appealing, perhaps more desirable is the wieldy intimacy of, say, the Matthew Marks or Xavier Hufkins dimension." So all this brings us back to the very start. This question of who is the new collector, one answer to that is actually we have more information almost about who the new dealer is, and that's a good starting point, I think, to build out from. But in terms of actually answering the question of who the new collector is, I think that unless we want what we've been seeing this year, which is to say a lot of gallery closures and kind of middling auction results and people being really panicked about the future of the industry, I think if we don't want that to become the norm, we have to get really curious and I think really humble about the idea of actually listening to what people in the next generations have to say to us about it. And on that point, I want to bring up Mazdak, who will help me get into kind of the Avant Arte community and everything that they have going on from a youth perspective. So, Mazdak. No. Do you have a chair preference? Okay, all right. This one? No? Oh. Okay. By the way, is your finger okay?
It's okay. It's been better. I had a fight with a drill yesterday, so apologies for my current look. I still have a bit of pink at the end of it, so I can count my blessings.
I feel like that's a good metaphor for the art market right now.
Well, it's repairing, so maybe that's a further.
Yeah. Let's focus on the positive here. All right, so I think that we wanted to start with this idea of doing a little myth busting about Gen Z collectors and younger collectors in general. So I want to play devil's advocate here. I'm going to try to like age myself mentally, like 30 or 40 years, and I promise I won't do like an old person's voice. That would be insulting. But I think, how about this? So most people, I feel like, based on the conversations that I've had, when they think of Gen Z collectors, what comes to mind immediately is, oh, these are people who collect primarily for two things, and it's status and it's for the possibility of investment value. What do you say to those people?
I mean, I think it was exactly those sorts of assumptions and the discrepancy with what we were sort of seeing every day from our community and from new collectors that led us to want to make this report, do a series of insight reports that sort of tee up. I think are essential for how the art world engages with younger collectors, and I think we found that there were 7% of people from our survey of 5,000 that said that those things were important to them, but the overwhelming majority, sort of over 80%, collected because of a love for collecting. They collected because they wanted to express themselves, and they cared about the artists and the stories that were behind the artworks. And so, we saw that sort of day to day for 7 years of building Avant Art, but really wanted to sort of, pull those insights together into something that was a little more digestible. Because of, I think that sort of that stereotype is, probably leading to a missed opportunity with this new generation and how they're welcomed in.
Yeah, and actually, before we go any further, do you want to just kind of give an overview of both the report and just who you are as a company and like what you're, because I think of you very much in this lens of like you guys are people who figured out a way to get people who aren't necessarily from the art world excited about art, which I think is a really valuable thing to have out there in the world right now. But I'll let you say whether or not that's accurate. It'd be great if you're just like, actually, that's completely wrong. So don't hold back.
Sure. I mean, the background to Avant Art was probably, accidentally we had, we sort of built an online community of young people, young enthusiasts, before we ever had a model of working with artists and of working with collectors. And so I think, I was thinking about when you were sort of describing Tim's quote of, this sort of insatiable desire for opening new space. And I think, probably the difference that we had is we had, we started as a blog of people discovering artists that we were publishing without really a commercial model. It was just for the love of, discovery of art and artists. And we just heard again and again this refrain of, we from our community of, we have the means, we're curious and interested, we just don't know where to start with collecting. We don't want to be embarrassed, or we're successful in our broader lives, and we really just don't know enough. And so I guess we started working with artists to make collecting their work feel more accessible through limited editions, some large-scale sculpture, but it was really born of that insight that we were getting again and again, which was, all the fundamentals from this new generation were there. They had the appetite and the funds and the cultural inclination, but they didn't feel like there were the right entry points or access points for them to start collecting. And so, we built a community of 3.5 million people online, a couple of 100,000 people who have told us what types of work and what genres and what types of artists they'd like to collect. And I think the report, the sort of second report we've done, is with a view to trying to create a bridge between this younger audience and the art world, and trying to think about ways in which, in the immediate term, we can introduce totally new people to collecting, but how, with the right stewardship and development and dialogue, these people can be turned into a new generation of patrons over time.
I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of just figuring out kind of which types of artists this community is interested in, because one of the other, I think, misconceptions about, at least in my view, about Gen Z and even younger millennial collectors, I think, is this idea that, oh, they don't really care about the canon or art history or any of these other kinds of in their minds, outdated things. Like what they want is Beeple and Alec Monopoly, and maybe they'll collect some bear bricks in there and whatever else, and like that's the focus, that's the move. I don't want to denigrate that stuff necessarily, but can you talk about within the avant art community, like what are you seeing in terms of the types of artists that people are interested in? Like, does that narrative play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to something you said from your introduction, which is, there's a perception of homogeneity within new collectors, which I think is quite problematic or unhelpful. And, there's a hugely wide range of collecting interests. I think, if you looked back to 2018, 2019, the early days of the pandemic as well, I think there was a huge volume of new people that had maybe come in through NFTs and digital art. There were lots of people who came across from street culture, and yeah, maybe we're interested in bear bricks and other things. I think the environment's changed quite a lot in the last couple of years, and I think younger collectors are similarly discerning. I think the sort of the froth in the market has dissipated, and I think that I think that, for example, we worked with Ed Ruscha last year for his fundraising for his exhibition at LACMA, and there were 2,000 people that bought his print edition that we made around the show. 40% of whom were new collectors, so first serious purchase of a work of art. And I think Ruscha is probably not what comes to mind when people think about when sort of put next to bear bricks or new collector stereotypes. And so I think there's huge amounts of new energy from this generation that are not tied to those sort of stereotypical entry points. But to your point, I also think that it may not be my taste or your taste, but I also think that people spending their time and energy and money on cultural objects of any sort, forgetting curatorial sort of distinction, I think is a positive thing. They're not buying, they're not spending money on, sneakers. They're not spending money on various nefarious things they could be doing on the internet. And so I think that they're also really valuable entry points. If people are buying a Takashi Murakami print for the first time because they've seen a fashion collaboration, I would say those people are incredibly well qualified to then convert into much wider collectors of contemporary art. And I think sometimes it's those, it's those stereotypes and sort of pigeonholing that probably prevents them from developing in a sort of non-linear sense.
Yeah, I mean, this gets at something that always frustrates me about the conversation about onboarding new collectors and especially younger collectors, which is you'll hear dealers and other people who care about the continuation of the art industry say, like, oh, we just really want to get new people in, and like it doesn't really matter what the entry point is. Like the important thing is we can get them here, and then we can sort of help them develop. And like I think that that's the right attitude. The problem is that in practice, it seems like pretty much any time somebody tries to get into the art world through one of these doors, like again, adjacencies, whether it's a fashion collab or whether it's like another form of collectible or whatever, when you actually see people doing that, I've just too many times seen people who are already in the art world be like, no, not like that. Like, don't do that. We still want you, but just like do it on our terms. And I just feel like that's sort of a fundamental problem, that if you have that attitude of there is actually a correct, quote unquote, correct way to do this, and you're going to try to have this paternalistic attitude about it, just seems like, yeah, no wonder there's going to be problems onboarding people who aren't necessarily already a part of this world.
I think that's right. I think the real talk for me is that we're all guilty. I think we're all guilty of it. I think those sort of threads of judgment are in everyone's minds. I think it's about self-management with an end goal that is about the future of patronage and the future of collecting, and I think that requires you to sort of defer those judgments with that end goal in mind. But I guess what I want to say is that I think I think those things are always things everyone's managing and battling for sure.
Yeah, I also feel like it's important to point out that even the artists who sort of get pigeonholed in that way are not necessarily doing the types of work that I think that they get pigeonholed for. Like, Cause is making bronze sculptures with Skarstedt, and like Beeple is palling around with Caroline Christoph Bakargiev, and like even the sort of emblems, I think, for what the quote unquote wrong kind of collecting are, like not even those artists themselves have been static. Like they're trying to evolve too, I think, in the best cases. So it just seems like it's all the more reason that we should just, I guess, give people a little more grace or a little more credit and just try to say, well, okay, let's have a conversation about this, even if that isn't the choice that I would make. But like, why are you interested in this? What is it that's resonating with you, and like, how can we build on that?
Yeah, and I think there's countless examples that we have sort of day to day of people that when they sort of join our community, they tell us what genres and what artists they're interested in, and maybe they have come from an adjacency like graffiti culture or street art or any of the things you were mentioning. I think the number of times that we've seen people move incredibly swiftly from that to collecting a Jenny Holzer sculpture or something that really feels very different, unbelievably quickly. Just it just feels like a huge opportunity if we can create the right sort of entry points and dialogue that can help them widen the group of artists that they're interested in.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about how you guys do that? Because there is this big question, obviously, about how do you communicate with people who are of a younger generation? I think that those preferences we talked about in some cases are very real, and I think there are a lot of people who are out there struggling with trying to figure out what the right path to choose is. What have you all found to be effective in helping to sort of develop or evolve people who don't have a grounding in this world into people who actually are really excited about it?
Yeah, I mean, we think about it in a few different ways. One is, amongst our 3.5 million people, there are lots and lots of people that don't have the means to collect even our sort of limited edition price points. And, I think for those audiences, there's a large portion of them that will at some stage have the means. And I think, for those audiences, it's about, inspiration, it's about storytelling, it's about trying to create points of access but also depth and interest around artists and their stories. I think there are there's a group of collectors either existing or sort of qualified and wanting to start their collection, in which they really, this new generation really, despite the stereotypes, really cares about craft and the thoughtfulness of not only what's gone into the work, but its presentation. We think a huge amount about the experience of sort of opening your work. So I think a lot of the storytelling we do is really around the craft of printmaking and the subjectivity of the relationship between master printer and artist and different things. And I think thirdly, after people have bought a work, certainly online, which is where we sell work, in the e-commerce landscape in general, I think it's very sort of it's very finely tuned, the processes that get people to part with their money online, and then in our experience, people are totally left. As soon as you've got your order confirmation, you don't hear another thing until something arrives, maybe to your neighbor. And so we think about that period, that sort of post-collecting period, as actually a huge opportunity for storytelling. So again, talking about the sort of the craft that's gone into the production of the work, talking about which exhibitions the artist might have in the local city, and being able to sort of target collectors based on geography. But we sort of think about it in those different ways, depending on where in the collecting journey people are.
I also want to talk a little bit about the way that this demographic or these demographics are interacting not just with the market, but with institutions and kind of nonprofit patronage, because the majority of the report is actually really about patronage on that side of things. There are some things in there about dealing, obviously. But can you kind of talk a little bit about what behaviors or what opinions cross over from younger patrons' perspective on institutions, and then like how that transitions over to the market?
Yeah, I mean, the basis of the report that you had an image of was really, when we did our first new collectors report 18 months ago, we found that, there were a couple of stats that really stood out, and it was that, of the, I think, 3,500 people we surveyed, 75% of them had the means and inclination to give more to our museums, and of them, 82% didn't understand how to. So didn't understand the sort of the patronage or sort of membership pathways that are clear to lots of people working in the arts. And I think so. The focus of our second report was really, the relationship between this new generation and institutions, both sort of non-profit institutions and more broadly, galleries. And we found, contrary perhaps to the stereotypes, the vast majority of this new generation care deeply about our traditional institutions. Yes, they are, one of the primary ways that they discover art and exhibitions and artists is online, but overwhelmingly they thought that not only are galleries and institutions important for the future of art, but they thought philosophically they're important for the fabric of society. I think 83% said they, galleries and institutions are important for the fabric of society. And so, I think, to your question on the read across, I think, the main one is on dialogue and stewardship. We found when, thinking about the museum shop, for example, we found that, collectors were 4 times more likely to want to spend more than $500 in a museum shop if they understood that what they were spending contributed to the operating costs and the sort of future of the museum, which again feels obvious to lots of people working in the arts, but really isn't to this audience. And so I think being able to create access points and help steward people from making their first purchase and being welcomed perhaps from adjacencies, through to being the major donors and the patrons of tomorrow. I think there's a direct read across with new collecting.
Being flagged that we need to move to the Q&A portion, but before we do that, I just want to ask if there's sort of one idea that you could leave people here in the audience with today in terms of thinking about Gen Z and younger millennial collectors. Is there anything that we haven't already covered that really stands out to you as like, that's really important?
I mean, I think it may sound trite, but I think the one thing is, they are the future of art. And so the way that we engage them and steward them and develop them is critical for everything that we're all focused on.
Okay, well said. We're going to move into Q&A. I think we have mics going around, so just raise your hand.
So, my name's Tasneem Salam, and my question, it's really interesting talk, both of you, the data, etc. But I wondered if in the research that you have done, there was any gender variation. If you look, because, my gallery, I'm younger bloomer, and I have been able to really bring in a lot of female collectors that have just sort of didn't think maybe they'd been overlooked. But then I would have thought that going on to the future generation, where there will be more women with professions, etc., or just inheriting wealth, So I wonder if there was any sort of differences, or maybe it's a difference that doesn't matter anymore in the future. What are your views on that?
Well, so a couple of things spring to mind here. One is that, to go back to the great wealth transfer, I'm not going to remember the specific statistics, but sometime in the next 10 years, I think, women will control the majority of wealth in the world, and that'll be the first time that we know of that that's ever happened. And I feel like that transition is actually probably at least as important, if not more important, than talking about the generational differences, because from other studies that I've read and people that I've spoken to, there is, on average, a really fundamental difference in the way that women approach collecting and really all financial decisions than men. Like, this is really a place where the stereotypes, or some of the stereotypes, are true, which is that men will do this kind of swashbuckling thing where they're just like, ah, yes, I'm going to buy that and I'm going to sell it for 10x tomorrow, or something like that. And women are much more rigorous, much more circumspect, really want to understand what they're buying, why it's worth what it is. And it just, I have in confidence spoken to some male dealers who are just like, I don't know about this, man. Like, they ask hard questions. And like, that's an important thing in and of itself. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I came across immediately on that front. I would say that in terms of, to go back to millennial wealth, for all the stats that I gave you about like how well they seem to be doing as a group, we seem to be doing as a group. I was really dragging the average down, for the record. But the thing that one of the things that you see there is that the gaps between things like different races, different genders, different education levels, they're actually more severe within the millennial cohort than they have been among Gen X and boomers. So even though the overall picture is still very good, there is, if you dig a little deeper, there's some reason to be concerned about the idea that it may actually be kind of backsliding to some extent into a more unequal world, as opposed to it being all good news and the younger generations are getting richer and isn't that wonderful. So those are the two things that stand out to me right now. I'm sure that we can dig way, way deeper into this topic.
More opportunity.
More opportunity, absolutely.
Women
Yeah.
are thinking more about, as you say, women collect in a different way. Maybe they're not going to, they're going to collect both on the internet and physically, and they're going to think more, maybe they're more serious collectors, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, I think building on that point, I think we, and what I was referring to earlier with the sort of shift in the current environment versus maybe the sort of pre and early pandemic period of collecting. I think, in 2018, I think our gender split was 80-20 male, and that was a moment of swashbuckling, lack of discernment. That was just the environment at the moment. This year is the first year where we're a slight majority female, and I think it goes to exactly what you're saying. I think it is a different mode of collecting. I think it suits this moment. 100%.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Sí, okay. Hello. Yeah, it's more not a question, but just my observation. I really appreciate and admire the Avant Arte because, coming back to my question to the art fairs, to the same millennials, because, I am millennial myself, I can speak about Gen Z, but the same people who don't know about the art fairs apart Art Basel in different places and Freeze, for example, everybody knows Avant Arte. And people do buy that. And I just think that you found some perfect combination because apart from just art, you offer some game. It's like the time-limited collections and everything, and people just are eager to enter to this game as any consumption. But in the end, they end up consuming art, which is really great. And thank you for that, because I think that's, well, to me, MoCA Museum and Avant Arte are the perfect entry points for the millennials to the art sphere. And then, well, I think that our mission of the art fairs, the institutions, the galleries, is to educate people more. When they see the blue chip artist for a tolerable price, then we can educate them more and just, well, try to introduce them to the wider world of art. But thank you for that. Thank you for introducing people to that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mariana. I collaborate with a group in Miami that is about democratizing access to art too. It's more like an in-person organization, 101. It's a small group of collectors commissioning together local artists. So I'm very interested because I'm doing a research project about storytelling on the impact of telling the stories of the artists, of the people in the community. And I wanted to know, I'm sorry, I'm nervous. If you have a specific findings about how much storytelling and telling the stories of the artists and the people influences people coming into collecting. So if you have more info about that, appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, we see that every single project that we do. We've done, I think, 800 projects now with artists, and there's a huge part of our time and focus and team that are really dedicated to storytelling. I think, I think again, what seems to resonate really strongly is, hearing directly from the artist, hearing directly from makers, so whether they're printmakers or foundries, but also I think, I was talking with Laura earlier about just the sort of overwhelm of visual culture, currently, and I think sometimes stripping back communication to its simplest form really resonates. So we found, for example, sending sort of rich text email with no imagery, with just links to exhibitions from artists of who collectors had collected in the past. We found that had incredible responses, and I think 25% of the people that we wrote those emails to wrote us letters back, and I think abstracting that, it's really around trying to start a dialogue, and we find, we earlier this year started to include a sort of part of our survey to collectors after they'd bought. There's lots about did the delivery go okay? Do you like the quality of your work, etc., etc. But we included this sort of open text field around, do you have a message for the artist? And it's the most inspiring reading. We, sort of put all of that together and share it with the artist. But if I need a pick me up in my day, I will go and read those sections because it's really inspiring. And I think it is because people feel like there is a direct dialogue, which feels very unusual today. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because we found the thing is a very small footprint, so we're trying to find out ways of reaching more people. We're trying to find ways of reaching more people, but we don't have overhead. So, thinking of storytelling, these artists that are from Miami now, they can communicate with more people outside of Miami, and they can expand the reach, and more people will get to know them and generate this ripple effect to bring more people in the art world. And these stories will bring them maybe to get interested in collecting, maybe in their communities, if not in ours. But yeah, it really resonates with me. That's why I was asking. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're
Sí,
going to leave it there.
exactly.
All right. Mazdak, thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you very